Hi, I'm Damien Porter, former Special Forces operator, high performance living coach from eatwellmovewell.net, and you're listening to my Straight Talk Mind and Muscle podcast. Subscribe for more amazing tips, interviews, and wisdom from phenomenal guests, and get your free copy of my 5-day meal plan and exercise ebook at realketonesaustralia.com. This show is sponsored by realketonesaustralia.com, the best and most effective ketone supplement on the market to reduce anxiety, enhance brain performance, and supply twice as much energy as glucose. You can find all my former shows on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Google, Amazon, and Libsyn. Thanks for watching and listening. Mark Mathieson, Nature's Blueprint, Rewilding Your Mind in order to achieve elite performance. An amazing, refreshing talk with a very clever man who specializes in the study of human behavior. Mark is an expert in the field of sustainable high performance and has worked with the highest performing people in the country, from Special Forces, Australian Commandos and SAS, through to Australian Institute of Sport. He now consults for many high-profile reality TV shows such as Survivor, The Bachelor, Bachelorette, SAS Australia, and many more. You can find Mark at markmathieson.com and on Insta at mark.amathieson. Now listen closely for the pure gold he gives out about the keys to a robust base of mental health, physical, psychological, and social health. The flip side to this is the person who becomes elite at their sport or career at the expense of all the other aspects of life that a well-rounded and firm-based person possesses. As Mark says, if and when their sport and career is taken away or comes to an end, they can often fall apart. We spoke about our mutual friends and former colleagues, Ollie Ollerton of breakpoint.co.uk, Nick Caldwell of themillgym.com, Dr. Dan Pronk of resilienceShield.com, Christian Thibodeau, Olympic coach and Olympic athlete of Thib Army, Delta Forces Sergeant Major John McPhee, Richie McCaw, New Zealand All Blacks rugby legend, Commander Joe Deturi, drdeepsea.com, Joe Hortai of zeroalpha.co.nz, and of course a great shout out to Isabella Rossitano, aka on Insta at the Aussie Ferocity, for introducing Mark and I and making this show happen. This show is a must listen for anyone going through a life transition of any kind, who feels that there is some part missing in their life ecosystem, and definitely the veteran, soldier, emergency services operator who is looking at or going through transition to a new career and life path. Thank you, Mark, for such an enlightening and meaningful sit down, and I look forward to speaking with you again. And we're live. Welcome to the Straight Talk Mind and Muscle podcast. Welcome to the Eat Well Move Well radio show. Try my absolute best to get the introduction right. Mark Mathieson, welcome to my show. It's lovely to have you on.
Pleasure. Looking forward to a great conversation.
Look, we're just chatting before. It's always great to get to know someone organically as I record. Now, you're a psychologist, military background, and I know nobody likes to turn their own horn, but it's always a little bit better to get the story straight. You've done 22 years in the military and some time in Special Forces. Can you just talk us through your background there before we move on to painting the picture for the listeners about the shows you've been on and where you're at now?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of fell into the military, really. I mean, my interest in psychology was primarily in sports psychology. So I was always fascinated by people performing at the pinnacle of whatever area of life, I guess, they'd chosen. So initially for me, that was sport. As a young man, I was an athlete myself. And this is where the story gets a little bit weird in that I know you interviewed Dan Pronk a little while ago, and there's some very scary parallels in that. I was a high level triathlete, was sort of, getting to the stage where I was, finishing in the top 10 and thinking, what else do I need to do to get to that, be on the podium? And the sacrifices required in terms of time and effort and motivation for me just seemed so disproportionate to the incremental, sort of results required, that I thought, oh, look, I can't make a go of this. It's going to kill me. And I meant by killing me, I mean, socially, you can't have a life. You're dedicated almost in your entirety to the sport. And I was studying psychology at uni. I was interested in sports psychology. And I just thought, this is not good. It's not healthy. It's obsessive, and it tends itself towards all sorts of things. So I guess I scouted around thinking, well, and look, the other problem with sports psychology in Australia is that it's very hard to make a living. Athletes are often broke, and as a sports psychologist, you're a relatively expensive addition to their coaching team. So you're often the last person they consider and the first person they get rid of if things aren't going well. Anyway, so I didn't want to make a living out of that, or I couldn't make a living out of that. So I thought, well, where else in the, I guess in the business or corporate world, or, how can I make a living out of this psychology thing that's still focused on, I guess, the positive aspects of performance, not fixing people that were broken, and has elite elements to it. And I guess the military kind of was the obvious answer. So I joined as a reservist. I've always been a reservist. I've dipped in and out of what we call CFTS, so continuous full-time service, a contract work for full-time periods, but mostly been a reservist. And so that was like 23 odd years ago. I joined the reserves. Spent the first couple of years as a soldier, just as a reserve soldier. I wanted to get the rubber stamp to say that, I could do basic training and do all those things. I thought that was important.
Yep.
As a potential psychologist in the military, to have some credibility. You start well behind the 8 ball as a psychologist in uniform. So I went and did a couple of years as a soldier, did basic training, did all those sorts of things, and then was finishing off my master's degree in psych, and then transferred across into the officer stream as a psychologist. It then took me about another 5 years to work my way through all sorts of bureaucratic and political sorts of barriers. My goal was to get to work with special forces. I was told fairly early on that would never happen as a reservist, that there was, you just weren't going to have the opportunity. And as with a lot of things in life, if you're a driven sort of person, you just slowly chip away at it and you have a strategic plan. And so, 2005, I got posted into 1 commando regiment, so reserve commandos. And really the world opened up from there in terms of, I guess, like a lot of things, if you prove to be capable and you're accepted by the culture and the ethos within the units, and you don't step on the proverbial, then slowly more and more doors open. So I built a career predominantly in and around special forces, from, I guess, as a young officer, as an operational officer, doing all the things that, psychologists do practically in the army. And then got promoted to my highest level of ineptitude and started writing policy, in and around those things as well, which I think, like a lot of young officers, you think is going to be terrible, but it's actually quite a nice way to give back and shape things for future, for future soldiers, and for soldiering to be, a better profession for most. And then, sort of got to lieutenant colonel. Found myself in the heady echelons of Canberra writing policy, and just lost the mojo. It wasn't for me. And so sort of slowly faded into the background and moved out into the corporate world about 2010, 2011.
You're in a very different place now. So I want to, hopefully, I said this morning to my other guest, I can't believe I've gone from being an operator to a fireman to interviewing people. So hopefully I get it right. But I painted that picture at the start. Let's move on to where you are now, and then we'll just sort of fill the gaps in between. So you're in a very different place now. And I love the quote we've got there: an expert in the arena of sustainable performance and eco-psychology. An example of that, you are a psychologist on set for many different shows. I just looked at, you've got Alone coming up, which is going to be phenomenal. Bachelor, Bachelorette, SAS Australia, where we talked about some of the connections. And I must give Isabella Rosatano a shout out for connecting us. She was crucial in that part. But that's a very different realm now than what you got into, and literally as your goal of chipping away. What are you doing now, working with corporates and so on? What's your main role?
So look, a bit of a funny journey, and like many, there's a great theory in terms of strategic planning called Theory U. And you literally think of the letter U. You start off and you can sort of see across the canyon, you can see a viewpoint, the other side of the U that you want to get to, but you have to go down and through the canyon before you can get back up the other side to that point. And sometimes in that journey, as you go down and into the bottom of the canyon, you find that you have to take different routes in life. You have to different opportunities and different learnings. And so you might not end up coming up to the other top of the U in exactly the spot you envisaged, but it unfolds through the journey because you can't see down into the bottom of the canyon. And that's kind of really the way I think about my career. I certainly had no aspirations to end up as an eco-psychologist, and that's a loose term that even I sometimes cringe a little bit about. But it is the reality of the journey that I've been on. And really that journey is spending the first sort of half of my career working with very elite individuals and teams in a number of domains of their, of life. So sport, I worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for a little while, worked with some athletes in the military, obviously, in terms of special forces and a range of sort of careers in there, the corporate world, and I'll come back to that a little bit in terms of mining companies and remote austere spaces, the Antarctic division. And the common element on that journey, I guess, down into the depths of performance psychology is that one of the things that became really apparent is that quite often that model of do more, strive harder, add more, I call it the moron approach, add more on to your life. It is extremely functional and very successful in a very limited domain of life. And so rather than becoming a generalist, so you have this broad base of really solid skills that you can project, a certain strategic direction forward in life, you end up with these very narrow, highly individualized people or personalities. And as a result, they are incredibly capable at that one or two things that they do, and quite often very dysfunctional in very other areas of life. They have such deficits in other areas that if you take away that one thing that they're good at, they crumble as people. They're not well-rounded. They don't have a firm base to project that effort from. And a good example is elite athletes. I mean, certainly at places like the Australian Institute of Sport, we surround them with teams of sports scientists and psychologists and nutritionists and coaches, with a view, of course, of helping them to become extremely elite at that one element of their performance being their sport. So they would do that for enough of their adolescent life that the social supports would fall away. So their friends would all become sport-based friends. Their sort of professional relationships were all around sport. Their family often faded into the background. So they'd move interstate or move to where the coach, they were separated from their family. And then if they suffered a career-ending injury, they had nothing. Like they literally fell apart as people because they, would obviously pack up and go back home, but they didn't really know their family very well. They had no friends back there. They had no other career alternative. And they literally would fall apart as people. And you see elements of that in many other domains. So corporate high flyers, I did a lot of work working in mines, recruiting sort of executives for mining companies, extremely functional at going away and setting up, these mining operations in remote and austere environments, incredibly dysfunctional back in their normal everyday life. They're antsy, they can't sit still, they can't sort of do normal family things. And some of those things are probably sounding familiar to you from a military perspective as well. So, guys that are amazing, spend long periods of time away from home, can operate in high functional, extremely, close-knit teams, yet can't relate to their kids. They get frustrated with simple things like, standing in the banking queue, all those sorts of things. Now, I'm not saying that applies to everyone, but as a general rule, what I found is that the model was lopsided. The model was promoting this elitism and specialization to the point that it became dysfunctional for many people if that was taken away. So that couldn't be the answer, I guess, if you want to talk about sustainable high performance. it couldn't be a highly specialized version of that. In fact, I guess what I found the answer was then to say, well, what is sustainable? You know, if you use that word in all senses of its definition, what is sustainable human behavior? And so the first place I looked was into the sustainability literature, the environmental, and dare I say, green literature around, well, what's a sustainable ecosystem?
Right.
Anyway, so I started doing some research in that space, looked into, I guess, all of the somewhat esoteric, left-leaning sort of, I'll call it loosely Eastern philosophies, and a lot of the environmental philosophies. And the thing that kept coming out of me is, well, nature is the model. Nature, and we are part of nature. I mean, we are an animal on this planet. And all of our systems evolved originally from very sustainable bases. It's only as we've drifted further and further away into the so-called developed space that we've become able to specialize and sustain that. You know, if you were highly specialized in older societies, you either had to have a pretty good use that you sustained, or you were cut away. You know, it's too decadent to have all these highly specialized individuals. You needed to be good at most things. Absolutely. In order to support the community and support your family in staying alive. And think about a subsistence-based farmer, all the skills that you needed just to feed your family as a subsistence-based sort of farming operation, as opposed to now where, you know, many people don't even know how to grow a garden. So talk about, 7 meals between, sort of democratic, highly functional societies in chaos. So 7 meals is not a long time to get a vegetable garden going if the world falls apart. So we've become specialized and we promote that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it comes with some baggage. It comes with some liabilities. So the answer for me was to move into the space around what is sustainable performance. And I thought initially that it wouldn't gel with working in TV or working in corporates, because they're well and truly wedded to that sort of specialized model. But the more I sort of work in that space, the more I see, well, everybody can do with this sort of approach. It's not rocket science. It's actually quite a logical approach. And the more you think about it from a performance perspective, the easier it is to see that if you've got that really firm, broad base of physical, psychological, social health, then you can lean out into extremes because you've got the stabilizing factor to fall back on. And that's really the bit that's missing, I think, in a lot of people's lives, is the stabilizing base of broad physical skills, psychological skills, social skills, to allow them to lean out and perform at their best. It gets wobbly, they fall over.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. You've really touched on a lot of points there for me to unpack.
Sorry, I can talk. Psychologist.
I can write. So starting with the sports psych side of things, Richie McCaw's movie. So again, for the listeners who don't know, hopefully you do, I think one of the best rugby players of all time, a New Zealand All Black captain. And in his movie, they showed the sports psychologist being a crucial part of identifying strengths and weaknesses. But I love what you've done. And Nick Caldwell, who you may know, runs the Mill Gym here, former Commando and SAS. He uses psychologists as performance enhancement. And that's what you're talking about, performance psychology. And it's brilliant the way that you approach, because, okay, is someone below the bar? Okay, we bring them up, and then we can push them above the bar, which is brilliant. But it does also tie into Dan Pronk's book with the Resilience Shield, all of that firm base. And everybody says the same thing in so many different ways. I interviewed Commander Joe DeTuri, a phenomenal guy in America and University of South Florida the other day, and he talked about being comfortable in chaos. For us types of people, so we got the military guys, you've got sports people, the people that are niche that you talked about, we tend to overdevelop. Please correct me if I'm wrong, absolute layperson here. We tend to overdevelop this fight and flight part of our system. Most of it's fight or really, and we underdevelop the rest. And that means that we, as you see, get wobbly or fall over once that's gone, but we're comfortable in that. And I've interviewed so many people in that space, both people like yourselves, people like Dan, a doctor, but also someone that's been there. And then the guys on the other side, tier one operators. we revert to that because we're really good at that, but our brain is wired that way. But it's because, and I think you said it, I just say it in a different way, we haven't grown those other synapses. We haven't grown those other muscles, those other parts, as you said, maybe going away from the family, maybe going away from the friends, and we need to regrow that. And is that what you're getting at with that base?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would argue that one of the disadvantages we face at this particular point in time is that we're kind of going back and relearning some old truths, right? I think everybody would understand that having a general firm base, a good solid life, a good solid relationship with a partner, family, friends, being healthy, we all understand that ideally is there. What I think has happened over the course of certainly the last 100, 150 years, 200 years is that elements of that have been eroded, not intentionally, but just through the chase for the dollars and the chase for exceptionalism and the fear of missing out. So we've kind of got, I'll put them back when I get time. And I guess what I'm really saying is they should have been there in the first place. And that's the fundamental philosophical flaw with our approach, is that we focus only on building the elite skills, the narrow niche skills, when in actual fact, we just assume that some of those other things are there. In fact, the whole premise of psychological selection, for selection courses and many things is just checking to see if enough of those elements are there that the person will be stable. But then it's a sort of a one strike and you're out box. So we assume that if you've got a stable enough childhood and a stable enough adolescence, you're physically fit, you've got some friends, you've played some sport, you've kind of well-rounded enough that you'd be suitable for a special forces operator, that's always going to be the case. We don't then take into account that we then spend the next 20 years destroying your family, destroying, your physical health, destroying all these other things, and then going, oh, you can add it back later. And then wondering, well, why people, towards the end. It's because we've eroded all those things, again, not intentionally, just through the way we live our lives, when in actual fact, they should have just been maintained the whole way along. So I'm a bit of an advert of, rather than saying we should reteach them, we have to clearly, because people are already well down that path. We need to address that, the horse is already bolted. But I would say we need to be going back to, to our communities and our cultures and our schools and where we form the basis of those things and saying, here are the basic skills you need to be working at through your entire life.
Yep.
Yeah. And you can't pay them off. You can't pay off the fact that you've got no friends. You can't pay off that you don't have a social support system or that your family distance from your family, because once the horse is bolted, it's really hard to put those pieces back in. It's a bit like physical health, isn't it?
You're back to the gym, or whatever analogy you want to use.
I'll start going to the gym next year, when I've got time. Yeah, too late. You get old, and it gets hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, it's not saying it can't be done. I just think we've kind of got it backwards. We've lost sight of those things. We've devalued them, certainly because it's hard for corporates to make money out of them. And what we should be doing is doing both. We need to redress, that the horse is bolted and come up with strategies to reconnect people with those things and give them skills around it. But why aren't we going back into schools, and why aren't we going back into those basic institutions of acculturation and teaching people, reteaching people, because it was originally taught, how to maintain those things from the outset. And so, having friends is important. You need to work at it. You need to have skills in working in a team. You need to have skills in maintaining your family. You need to look after your health and your nutrition. You need to understand how physiologically, that becomes the basis for your mental health. You can't just be mentally healthy and physically unfit. It doesn't work. They're not separate silos. They're all part of the same system. And I use you guys, those of your listeners that are military focused would understand the idea of projecting force, right? So when we talk about a military operation, we're projecting force, not just kinetic force, but psychological, social forces. We're trying to change things through effect-based operations, right? But you need to project that from somewhere. If you're standing on an ice rink and you're trying to project force in any direction, you slide around because you haven't got a stable base. And that's what I think a lot of the elitist components of our society has become. We don't have the firm base, and we're just skating in circles until we get so tired that we fall over.
It's a great analogy.
But the firm base needs to be there, and it needs to be maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that you touched on the physiology side, fancy word for
Mm.
the way your body is healthy and what you feed it.
Yep.
I interviewed Christian Thibodeau, former Olympic athlete, Olympic coach over in Canada. His parents were high-end psychologist from memory, literally trawling my brain here. But
Okay.
he literally states that psychology comes from biology. And we gave the analogy of someone coming in to see someone like you, Mark, drinking a Coca-Cola, had 5 coffees and eating a Snickers bar. It's not going to work so well. And then John McPhee, who I spoke about before, a Delta Force Sergeant Major. And when the Sergeant Majors talk, they're wise.
Yep.
I'm old, haven't got the wisdom yet, but I listen. And, even he's saying, if you're drinking and eating junk food, that's 80% of the problem right there. And this is a hardcore shooter. He's not a psychologist.
Yeah.
And it really does come down to look after that body, feed it the right fuel, which is what you're saying, performance, and then you get that performance psychology with some skills that you're reteaching that we definitely agree we've lost.
Absolutely. And look, I think, there's this artificial separation. Even my profession, specializing in the study of human behavior, but it's clearly classified as purely the mental side of things. So we talk about mind and body as being somehow separate, and clearly they're not. When we know that, a lot of our brain a percentage of our brain neurotransmitters are made in our gut.
Yeah,
they're made in our stomach, depending on what we eat, in our gut bacterium. And we know that, for example, under high degrees of stress or starvation, that the serotonin levels in our brain are mucked with, which impacts on sleep, but also heightens memory. So trauma comes from these periods of time when you're sleep deprived, under huge amounts of stress, and that somehow then lays down these high quality memories that we call trauma. It's your body basically saying, remember this thing, it's really important, it's going to keep you alive. If you remember everything about the situation, remember this. And so, of course, you then go forward for a large part of your life remembering that thing, which is really important because it kept you alive.
Yeah.
And we call it trauma and say it needs to be counseled away. So we've created this artificial separation, which is something that Western society is great at. It's separate things into, it's called reductionist science. It's pull it all apart, understand each component, and then by understanding each component, when we bolt it back together, we'll get a better performing machine. And it doesn't take account of the fact that there's all these synergies that happen when you look at the whole system in its entirety. And one of the problems with that is that, we've created all these professional groups that specialize in those things. And so, you need to be an expert, you need to go and see a dietitian, or you need to go and see, a psychologist, and they're all telling you slightly different things, and it doesn't quite bolt together effectively. And so, I'm a victim of that as well in my own profession. But, we need to start also looking at how those synergistic things work in their entirety. And that's a really hard thing for society and science in particular to like, because it kind of means deconstructing our own professional group sometimes, which people get a bit sketchy about because it's their income.
It's funny you say that. And I'm just coming off the back of Dan's Resilience Shield. What I loved about an excerpt of that, I'm not sure if you read it or not, was complex versus complicated. He stated what is sustainability behavior, and he talked about an ecosystem. And what I got from Dan in that definition is complicated is being able to write a manual on your car, which is what you stated about reductionist science.
Pull it all apart.
Term you used. Hang on a sec. We are complex ecosystems. It's not always linear. It's not always logical. You can do this action 10 times, get the response 10 times. You do it 11th, you get a completely different response. We are a system, and that makes it tough.
It does make it. Again, our mental models of much of human performance are those silos. It's easy for us to say, well, if I just feed myself certain things, that all my problems will be fixed. I can go and buy a product to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't allow for those synergies to occur. And a good example, and I don't want to take away from the fitness industry because, you know, many years ago, I was a fitness instructor, and I think it's a fundamental part of people's lives and should be. But, you know, exercise is a great example of an industry that's been commercialized, right? So most people, when you say, do you exercise, they immediately think of, do I go to a gym? All right. And again, nothing wrong with that. Gyms are, you know, great places. They're social. They have other motivating elements, and they have, you know, professional instruction and so forth to retain the knowledge that needs to be there if you don't have much of a background in exercise. But, you know, exercise used to be called running around trying to survive. You know, it was basically a functional thing that kept you healthy because you needed that health in order to catch things or, you know, be able to feed yourself. And that system's still there. I mean, I live on a 130-acre property. We've got, you know, plenty of standing firewood. You know, I need to cut firewood because it's the only way I can heat my water and stay warm over winter.
Yep.
I can turn that into exercise. You know, it already is exercise, but I can certainly in my head be going, well, do you exercise? Well, yeah, I cut firewood 3 times a week, and it's hard manual labor. And I make sure I understand how to do that without repeating certain muscle groups and change the, you know, so you can do 2 things at the one stone, and that becomes a bit more of a holistic system. So now I'm saving money. You know, so I'm cutting my own firewood. I'm maintaining an ecosystem. So I'm only cutting firewood down from certain areas so that, you know, there's regrowth and something on the property. I have to learn about that ecosystem. I need to know which firewood to cut down, which trees are the ones that burn well, right? And when should I cut them, at what age? And I'm doing exercise. And if I can drag a friend or somebody out to do it with me, then I'm doing a social activity as well.
Clever.
You know, so it becomes, it's not the entire system, but it's becoming a larger part of an ecosystem. So we are complex adaptive systems. We forget sometimes that, then this is going to be a little bit complex, but we don't stop at the layer of our skin, right? So we think of ourselves as being this thing, this body, but we have an impact outside of that. We have an impact in terms of social interactions. You know, people think about us, they plan for us. We have an impact in terms of providing food and support and love to other people. So we are enmeshed in our systems, you know, in our ecosystem, and which is why I call myself an eco psychologist. It's not to do with environmental stuff. It's just saying we are in inanimately complex adaptive systems, and we are intimately intertwined in all of the systems around us: physical, psychological, spiritual, and to think of ourselves as just somehow being separate from that is kind of a bit foolish. It's a little bit naive, and it doesn't do us any great services in terms of improving our performance, because it's all those other systems that we depend on and interact with that ultimately allow us to perform.
Absolutely.
If you don't get the support of your wife or your partner to go and do some of these, you know, activities, you know, you're not going to have a marriage for too long. If you're not going to, you know, have the economic capabilities to do some of these things, then you don't survive very long. But somehow we think we can.
You talked about Lance, talked about sports people near the start, and I just a couple people popped into my head, some crazy Tour de France stories I've heard, but Lance Armstrong is one that popped into my head just then. A great example of not just wobbly, but everything's fallen apart because of that singular, selfish, or I think selfish is probably a fair one, because it's only about the performance of that one person in that one aspect. And yeah, it is definitely not a firm base, and doesn't serve that person well later on when they can't perform anymore.
No, and that's one of the confounding variables in all of this is so much of our society has become supportive of that model that you can survive for quite a long time, you know, functioning in that very egoic manner. So it's about you, you know, it's about I'm going to achieve X, Y, Z. That's my goal in life, and you either come along for the ride or you don't. Yeah. And we've been able to artificially separate ourselves from the rest of, you know, the ecosystem through, you know, being able, if you've got enough money, you can buy just about everything. You know, you can buy support staff, you can buy a family, you can buy these ridiculous amounts of things, but ultimately it's a very amoral and unethical way to live. And usually, not always, but usually that comes back to bite you on the ass at some point in time. You know, if you can't sustain that incredibly resource intensive way to be egoic about, you know, elite performance, then the wheels get wobbly real quick. And we see that, quite sadly in, military personnel and other sort of paramilitary, once they get out of the system and the support system around them, not just financially, but, socially, ecologically, a place to live, a place to have a sense of meaning. Once all that's gone, they're lost.
Yeah.
And not saying they can't be saved, and that quite often many people make that transition, but gee, we chuck them into a giant abyss and say, good luck. I hope you make the transition.
That word is a big word that I'm only coming to understand more broadly lately. It's a change of identity. And we've talked about it with a lot of different shows that I've done, but that change of identity, you've got to be prepared for that. One of the standout ones I did was with an All Black, Conrad Smith. And he's now on the other side, where he's working with the Players Association, I think it was. But long story short, really for the listener, can you imagine winning a gold medal or winning a World Cup, and the next day you're retired, air quotes, at 31? And the verbiage is wrong, the identity is wrong. You've got to be really leading up to that, and you've got to have a very smooth transition. That might take years, but for some of us small-minded army guys or other people, it could happen in one day. You're walking out the door, and that's the abyss that you're speaking about, Mark.
Yeah, and again, we had processes, for this within community. They were seen as rites of passage. They were managed as rites of passage, and we had within our community people who were responsible for managing that transition. So we, loosely, I think the easiest word to use is elders. It's not a great word, but it means loosely that thing. They were the retainers of the knowledge of how to move people through the various stages of life. So how do you take a young boy or young girl and transition them into adulthood? How do you take a young adult and transition them into parenthood? How do you take a parent and transition them into elderhood? Or, retirement, or becoming the wise elder as opposed to being the doer. Now you're the person that people just come and consult with. So we had all those processes for thousands and thousands of years. And then Western science came along and said, oh, what a lot of, mumbo jumbo. We don't need any of that hippie stuff. We just give kids the keys to the car and tell them they can go to the pub and they'll be right. They'll manage it. Well, it's not really turning out for us that well, is it? Rates of mental health are going through the roof. We see all these sort of transitions in people's lives being handled relatively poorly, and the cultural knowledge to own and manage that has been stripped away through just not negligence, but just unintentional neglect.
Yeah, poor knowledge.
Yeah, and so we set people up for failure, and I think military people are a classic example of that, because there used to be a place in community for returned warriors. I mean, they had some really critical knowledge and experience about the horrors of war that communities need to know, because without that knowledge being sort of spread amongst the community in a sacred and a very careful way, it's not about coming home and telling horror stories, then the community has no reference point for why war is bad, right? Because we just, we see these glorified news reports on the news media, it's all glossy and it's further away. The psychological distance, as we call it in psychology, is so far that it's like, oh, well, it doesn't mean anything to me. I can just watch it on TV. It's just like a video game. Yeah. Whereas Uncle John coming home and saying, mate, this is what war's really like, that sunk in. It's like, yeah, actually, I can see it might be a bit of a boy's own adventure or girl's own adventure, and I can see that it's a challenge and an amazing experience, but it's pretty serious, and I need to really think seriously, about this. So that knowledge has been stripped away, and so now when we tell people like military personnel to come, they have to go back to being normal, to being civvies. So we're going to completely disregard all those experiences you've had. Don't tell your stories. We don't want to know them. Yeah, and just go back to being normal. That's what we want. We don't want to hear the bad stuff. And so you can imagine how damaging that is to people whose whole identity is wrapped up in having served their country, having taken on these psychological, the knowledge and experience, which is often horrific, right? It's pretty challenging. It's not great. And then being told, we don't want to know. We want you to just to go back and join the queue to the milk bar and buy milk and be happy about it. So talk about creating a giant psychological abyss for people to travel through. And look, surprisingly, as I'm sure you would agree, Damien, many people make that transition. It's not easy,
No.
but credit to most of the military personnel and fireys and other first responders who manage to somehow navigate their way through that, often on their own, often still go on and find a new identity, a new role, as you've done, for example, that's self-actualizing and meaningful and serves. But no one's helping them. We often just, say, oh, come and do your 6-week, transition to employment course, and we'll teach you how to write a CV and wish you all the best.
It's not about the job. It's not about the CV. Look, I think many people do. I was going to say no one epitomizes that more, but that's incorrect because there's thousands. But I was lucky enough to speak to Ollie Ollerton last week.
Sure.
And he does demonstrate exactly that. The darkest of places, and then pulled himself out of it, remodeled himself, and now using that quote of his training and experiences to help others, which is essentially tying your eco-psychology in a bit of a bow with the elder knowledge and passing that down to people who need it, to people who have missed out on it, and hopefully passing it forward to people before they need it, which Joe Hortai, again, someone you might know, he's really pushing that. So again, for the listeners, former New Zealand soldier with me, former commando with Australia, SAS Australia, and we've all got stories. He's got a lot of them, but he's sharing those stories now for that new warrior generation coming through, and hopefully giving them something to consider in their journey. I'd like to go back a little bit, if I could, Mark,
Sure.
because we talked about the modern stuff so much. You talked, and I'm gonna finish with the solutions that you see, which you've touched on, but I want to go back. You talked about those that money can just about buy anything, and those people that are really niche. We talked about sports people, and that dovetailed perfectly into SAS Australia, which is not the show I started watching 7 years ago, with these unknown operators just taking these civilians through in the UK. You guys deal with celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
You guys deal with the people that money can buy anything. And I've seen that on the shows. Literally, they've bought their faces and their bodies, some of them, and some of them have been Olympic gold medalists. Phenomenal. What did you learn on a show like that with those sort of people psychologically, both the ones who are out on day one and then the ones who made it to the end? What was your take on all that?
Look, I think the simple answer, I think, that I've learned in working on a lot of shows is people are people. And look, I'm certainly not sitting here saying I'm some model of perfection, and I'm sure you're not, just because we've had the experiences that we've had in life, and we might have a little bit of an esoteric knowledge base about it. It just doesn't make me any less prone to losing my mind when my partner leaves the bath mat on the floor than the next person.
Absolutely.
So, we loosely call these people celebrities, and I guess make a lot of assumptions about them by, judging a book by its cover or reading the news articles. But look, they're just people. They often, I think, their motivation to participate in a show like SAS Australia is genuine. They want to test themselves. They want to see where that limit is. Where are they at right now? How might they move forward? And I think the attraction for many of them is that the military model, which is grounded in reality, and all selection models, as I'm sure you'd agree, certainly in the military, are grounded on thousands of years of, if you ain't got this, you're not going to cut it in warfare. These are the bare minimum criteria, which I think is an innately human characteristic to want to know where you're at. And then when we talk about performance enhancement or elite performance, it's like, well, I need to kind of know where I am. I need to know where ground zero is, and see how far I can take that in a fairly honest and transparent process. And so, I certainly listened to your podcast with Dan, and I would agree with him that the selection model that they go through is loosely based on, certainly the British SAS selection process and some elements of the Australian, but perhaps not as much. But, it's a pretty robust selection model. And despite the fact it's on TV, and despite the fact that, you can't get away from the fact there are cameras and other people around, the psychologists on set, for example, we don't really mess with that bubble, that reality bubble. They are on their own for however long they last. They do not get daily debriefs at the end. They're not taken away to a hotel. They're in that reality, and the DS run the show. So in a sense, it's almost like a documentary. We just run around and film it. We don't intervene. They run a selection course, and these guys are on it. And then from the moment that the bubble descends, we're just there filming it, supporting it logistically, and the DS run the show. So I think that that sort of facade, if you want to call it that, which perhaps some celebrities come with of, I can bluff my way through this. I've been able to do that with everything else in life. It doesn't last real long. And that's what I think the viewers love watching the show is that, okay, finally, that guy that I think is a total so-and-so on TV, looks like a real, wanker. I want to see how he goes in something that is a black and white litmus test of capacity. Yeah. And we do. And some people surprise us, as you would expect. Selection courses are no different. Look at the lineup on any, certainly Australian SAS selection course, and it's not the big, burly, glossy, buff guys and or girls nowadays, who are always guaranteed to make it, if at all. It's usually the quiet, wiry, humble, observer, smart, intelligent, cagey person who just chips away at it, does their best, but understands the context in that it's a holistic psychological selection process. It's, have you got the innate characteristics that we're looking for? And so look, the shows this no different. And I think that across the board, whether it's, something a bit more, sort of mainstream glossy, like, Bachelor, et cetera, what you largely see as a psychologist is just normal human characteristics playing out on a set. Gets edited. There's some music put in the background. It starts to look a lot more dramatic than it is, but quite often the tears are genuine. Quite often the disappointment is genuine. Quite often the innate learning that some people take away from some of these experiences is genuine. Not everyone gets it. Not everyone gets on the bus and understands where the bus is going. But they're often in the minority. And I could say that about any process. I mean, I once took teenage kids from a fairly elite private school over to Nepal for a bit of a journey for self-discovery on a number of occasions. And, they all went there, I'm sure, with the best of intentions of helping the poor people of Nepal and doing their bit, not understanding perhaps that it was actually a process about them learning about us, our culture. And there was always a couple of kids that just didn't get it, and came away with what they would perceive to be a very negative experience. It was horrible. It was dirty. I didn't like it, but you get the majority who get it and go, wow, I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about other cultures. I've learned a lot about our culture. And they're the ones you go home and go, well done. Same with SAS Australia. Same with any of those shows. You'll get a mix. Most people get it, and I think go away maybe a little bit more humbled or a little bit more appreciative of either what military personnel do or what they need to do with their lives. It's just that it's on TV.
Yeah. And it is right from the first season, just watching those people go through it was a window into our world. And it's phenomenal. I said the other day, I was with Ollie, chatting to him, we see something on SAS Australia and I'll say to my partner, oh, they're going to do this. And a minute later, they do exactly that. Just, how do you know that? And it's just what we've been through.
Yeah, they're ground truth assessments, aren't they? That strip away. I mean, as I'm sure Dan alluded to as well, it's designed just to erode, dare I say it, all of the bullshit. Yeah. To get down to raw character. And you do that erosion through, deprivation, through sleep deprivation, not excessive amounts. You don't need to do much. Psychologically, we know people start to decompensate after 24 hours of no sleep. So cognitively, it don't take a lot for people to start to make bad decisions. And so you only need to mess with those characteristics a little bit. It looks horrendous on TV, and it's often not pleasant. But for those of us that have seen a full selection course or, other similar processes, you're like, oh, yeah, it's doable. It's okay. But for your average punter who's never had any exposure, it's, information overload. So you erode those characteristics, and some people just decide it's not for them fairly early in the process. You get about, a third or half of the way through the course, and then you're down to now we can start the assessment process. Now we can start. We've seen what the raw characters are. We know we've got the, I think it's usually Ant who says somewhere along the process, right, we've got rid of the chaff. We've got down to the raw character, and now we can start assessing you.
Exactly. Look, I'm going to push forward to the solution, and we've touched on it a lot with what you've seen as deficits. But one question stood out for me through the whole time with you, Mark, is media. And I was going to say social media, but I definitely going to class it as media. What impact do you think media has on the erosion of that really solid base in the last 20 years? I mean, I'm 48 years old. I'm thinking 20 years is 2002. That was Timor, that was there was 9/11. That's been around. And you were saying about the news, somebody can watch the news like they're seeing a video game, like wars just like that. And Ukraine's showing it now. I mean, we're desensitized already. It's been 3 weeks. It's horrendous. So what impact do you think media has, all sorts, on that erosion of that base, the erosion of what we were supposed to be teaching to our kids, and the kids especially learning? And they're literally 20 years old now.
Yeah, look, I think it's immensely powerful. And like anything that's immensely powerful, it can be used for good and for bad. I think at the moment, my personal view is that, it's probably not being used in a way that is ultimately good for certainly our communities. And certainly not great for our young adolescents, that don't have the risk framework or the experience in life to kind of make accurate judgments a lot of the time. They haven't got the breadth of base yet to go, I'm going to call BS on that news story. They kind of just absorb it all and assume that it's gone. So we've done two things have happened. I think we've eroded the basis of trust in our community. So everyone questions everything.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
All right. So you whether it comes from the Prime Minister or the government or anybody, we question it. Oh, it can't be accurate. So that's been a huge downfall in maintaining some of the social cohesion, because we just don't trust anybody. Well, we trust people to a certain degree, but when the chips are down, we know we're kind of on our own.
Yep.
So media's had a role to play in that, in the devolution of trust. And by the way, I don't think media is this, sort of, a dark entity that sits in the corner that's controlled by a group of elites. I think it's just it's a function of human communication that's sort of been lost in terms of who controls it. We control it. It's just that we've lost the sense of the fact that we can control it through our choices. So it chases us, a bit like the political spectrum now.
I think you've nailed it there, exactly. And that's why I used the term media. I didn't use the word reporting or news. And I incorporated social media. I incorporated
absolutely
the media of video games, the media of shows and things into that. But if you're saying things like they're chasing us, fear on them for telling us what we want to hear.
Yep,
because
absolutely,
we're going to then get them viewers by their newspapers and so on.
Well, we've monetized it. We've monetized, the short news cycle or the short media cycle, which absolutely is that, if it clicks and it sells, well, then you publish more of it, or you create more of it. And look, a lot of, I think politics is the same in that we've tightened the political cycle so much that it's just become politicians chasing votes. So. I don't think they're bad people. I think they often are quite aspirational to make things better, but they've got to stay in power in order to do that. In order to stay in power, you have to get votes. So it's a very short, 4-year cycle in Australia. And so those things have become a bit like Lord of the Flies. Who's running the where are the elders to step in and go, not so great, guys. This is not functional in the longer term. And you see that. I mean, you see it sort of in politics and people trying to introduce, anti-corruption bills, and it's there. It's still there. We still believe those things, but the horse has kind of bolted a little bit, and we don't quite know how to get it back under control at this stage. But I agree. I think the wheels are turning. Change. People. There's enough. I think I have enough faith in humanity that we learn a bit slow. Sometimes we learn generationally as opposed to, within our own lifetimes. Afghanistan's a good example of that. Probably needed another 10 years to really create change in Afghanistan, I would argue, because 20 years is about, an average generation. So you don't change the current people in power, you change the younger people coming into power, and then they change the system. And we've kind of got a similar thing that I think needs to happen within many of the sort of dogmatic structures in our communities. Politicians, I think, will change because young people will be sick of the current model and want to get into power to change it. Media will change. And I have enough faith in humanity that I'm sure that will occur because there's good people out there that see that the wheel turning, a bit like climate change. You'd think being an eco-psychologist would be one of the main interests, but I don't think you're going to change the climate until you change the people, and you don't change the people until you change the bit that's going on in their head that's supposedly running the show. So you've got to ground them in their own experience, have them experience, this is what it's like to operate from a firm base, and this is what it's like to be super healthy, and gee, I feel amazing, and I'm so much more capable. There's a great theory by a psychologist I like, Barbara Fredrickson, called the Broaden and Build hypothesis. And it's basically fMRI studies of brain activity, looking at the impact of positive mood on decision-making. Really simple little experiment. You show people positive pictures, like, uplifting, happy pictures. They make better decisions because the way our brain and our body works is that if you're in a good mood, you're in, lots of good endorphins are released, our brain functions better, we solve complex problems better. So it broadens our capacity to solve the next problem that comes along. You put people in a fear-based mentality and they shut down. They make bad decisions that spiral down into worse and worse decisions. And at the moment, we're kind of a fair way down that spiral. The news media is addicted to the negative spin, which then creates fear, and politicians are always worried about getting voted out. And so we spin in this sort of fairly dark place. But there's enough, I think, light at the end of the tunnel for us to claw our way back out of that. And, climate change will be the same, I'm sure. And politics will be the same.
That's really the last question, direction to go in is, what is a gross, a basic intent generalization of our way? What's our path to clawing our way out of that?
Well, I think it's reconnecting to some of those basic systems, those basic ecosystems, and having them become an innate part again of our understanding of how we as humans exist and function on this planet. We're not somehow separate. We can't escape the political cycle. We can't escape the economic cycle, the media cycle, the environment. We're intimately intertwined in this whole big system. And that shouldn't be an overwhelming, complex thing. It's actually quite a beautiful thing. It's, nature is, if anything, abundant. If you go to Bunnings, which is a hardware store here in Australia, if you've got listeners overseas, and you buy a punnet of tomatoes, right? Punnet's a little container. It'll have 6 little seedlings in it, right? So people think, I'm going to plant a vegetable garden. They put 6 of these seedlings. They pay, $10. Plant 6 seedlings. 4 of them die because they don't water them. The other 2 struggle on, and they grow 3 tomatoes that you're possibly going to be able to eat. And so, the artificial system of forcing nature into the ground and making it grow produces 3 tomatoes for $10. So suddenly you've got $3 tomatoes. It's like, well, why would I do that? Whereas, ironically, if you chuck away a half-eaten tomato that's still got seeds into your vegetable garden, it'll probably grow. The seeds that are in that tomato will self-seed, and you'll probably end up with 20 tomato plants who are, because they've been naturally planted there, will have worked out amongst themselves in the ecosystems that this is a good spot to grow. So they'll grow really well and they'll produce heaps of tomatoes. So for waste, you've suddenly got tomatoes. So nature has a lot of those simple answers. It's like, we just need to stop commercializing it and think, well, hang on, how did this system work originally? And how did humans work originally? It's not about going back into the bush and living in a teepee, and sort of that sort of side of things. But there are some clever systems built in to the ecology around us that we just need to learn to tap back into. How to eat well, how to generate that food, how to live in community and have good, social support. I mean, I talk about social capital a lot. How do you invest in your friends and your community? A form of capital that will come back to pay you a dividend. Sounds very economic, but the premise is valid. You invest in your friendships. You got to work at a friendship. It doesn't just happen magically. Ask a lot of young people, they look at you like you're weird. Don't I just message them on WhatsApp and they're my friends? Oh, no, they're not your friends, mate. They're your acquaintances. They make up your Insta profile numbers. But, I think getting back in reconnecting to those systems, building those firm bases early in life for most people, and learning how to drive that big, complex, adaptive system to then achieve sustainable excellence. Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, if we could teach that to our kids, what else do they need?
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful. You've talked a few times, just to sum up, working at that, doing the work there, putting the effort in. But you gave a great example of yourself chopping wood, all the different interconnectivity of it, and then just invite a mate along, and boom, you've got a big tick in that that social side, that part of the base. And Dan had one the other day. I've come back to him just a few times because a mutual friend on his socials. So like you were saying, it's how you use it, and it can be used in a great way. On his Instagram was out for a run. So there's the body side of it. In a new place, there's the creativity, the exploring side of it. And then with a mate, and there's just tick, tick, tick. It wasn't work. You didn't have to go away and do something. It was just a clever way. And how you sit there getting a mate along to chop wood, there's an example of application of those complex systems we have, but it's natural to do it as well. And it feels right.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, there's so much research literature, again, validating common sense in many ways. A lot of these things we end up deifying anyway. We say going out in nature is fantastic. Take photographs of landscapes. Well, why do we do that? Why do we appreciate natural landscapes? Why do we have celebrations, annual celebrations like Christmas and things like that in our communities? They all served a purpose. They all served a purpose to build those links and to have a common language and a common culture, to bring people together, to celebrate. Often celebrations are through food. There's a link back into food. So a lot of those things are buried within our culture, even our culture, certainly in Australia, an imported colonizing culture. We still have links back into many of the historical cultures. We've brought some of that stuff with us. And it's not to say that it needs to be rejected and replaced with something else. It's just, how do we indigenify it? That's not a word, but you get what I'm saying. How do we reconnect it to this place? The Maori in New Zealand are all over that, and probably, I think there's a lot of good stuff that we could learn as non-Indigenous Australians from other models, rather than continuing to say, no, we're a white country. Not a white country, we're a black country.
Again, it's complex. We're a complex system of humans.
Absolutely.
And we integrate it into this place, and integration is where New Zealand happened, but we integrate into our world, and this is our ecosystem wherever you live.
Correct. Yeah. Yep. And it's how you connect to that. I mean, I live on, as I said, 130 acres up on the Warby Ranges, which is river country, right? So there's we've got some fairly large river valleys that have major rivers that flow into the Murray, one of the largest sort of bioregions in Australia. But the town itself is geographically, in terms of roads, based on a sort of a meeting point where a major road heads off into the high country. So geographically, this town sits on a river flat. It's a river country. But the marketing spiel for the town is the gateway to the high country. So because the high country is seen as economically more attractive and people want to go to the mountains, why would they come to a river? So, we're kind of not place-based. We're just sort of selling something else that's not here, and it's disconnected and people don't understand it. And as a result, the township, has really struggled. People come here and go, well, there's no mountains here. Why is it the gateway to, I don't get, I'll just buy petrol and then leave. So, I'm sort of babbling a little bit, but you get the gist. There's so many interconnections from culture to place to ourselves, that the minute you start thinking about it in that sense, you start to see lots of opportunities that might only add small elements, but they build that firm base. If you are connected to a place culturally and geographically and physically, it's more powerful and more stable than not having a home.
Which goes back to what you were saying before with a simple study. Show someone a happy face, get them in a positive mindset, they make better decisions, which is all about the eco psychology that we've spoken of. And I'm really trying to paint that summary for that listener or viewer of this is applicable, this is doable. It's not have to go away and live by yourself for 3 months like Ollie did. It's that first step of getting made along or realize where you are. Mark, where can people go to find out more about you directly? We've got internet and socials. What do you want them to do there?
Yeah, sure. So look, I've got a very simple website, www.markmathieson.com. So that's fairly easy. And Mathieson spelled I-E, just to confuse people, the old Scottish way. But look, I think if people Googled Mark Mathieson and spelt it any old way they like and put the word psychologist after it, they'll find me. There's not too many psychologists called Mark Mathieson. And look, my email is simply that, mark@markmathieson.com. And on socials under Mark Mathieson. Usually there's some psychologist or eco-psychologist tapped in there as well, but people should find me from those links. Very happy to chat to people. Look, I get that it's a bit of an esoteric sort of somewhat unusual construct at this stage, but that's all the more reason for people to come and Google it and find out a bit and see if it's possibly helpful in their way forward.
Absolutely. And no, you're right. Out of all the guests I've had, you're the most easily searchable. I punched in Mark Mathieson and boom, it was there. I had the headshot, I had the bio. And I must say, you're epitomizing what I've tried to bring in, especially over the last 6 months, is using our training and experiences to help other people move forward. And that's really what you do. You said a bit esoteric. No, I think it definitely dovetails into where we're supposed to be. So thank you so much for your time, Mark. I really appreciate you setting this up. I know you were very busy. And it's just been an absolute pleasure listening to your take on things.
Thanks, Damien. Love chatting about it anytime, mate. So get me back on and we can talk about something else as well. I'm sure there's something else we can yak about at some point in the future if people aren't too sick of me.
Oh, absolutely. Sounds great. Thank you so much.